What is the purpose of a text whose audience is also the context of production? Only until you can answer that question do you fully understand these concepts of context, purpose, and audience.
Everything you need to easily pass English ATAR. English ATAR made simple. Powered by Saints Coaching.
Purpose and audience. Why are we addressing these two concepts in the same lesson? To take a step back, the reason why these concepts of purpose and audience are directly after the lesson on context, the one you just did, is because these three concepts all go hand in hand. I guess you would need three hands for them to go hand in hand, but you get the idea. This will become clear in Module 5 when we're discussing the composing section of the exam. More specifically though, we're discussing these concepts of purpose and audience in this lesson together because purpose and audience really are two sides of the same coin, and they're both fairly straightforward concepts to understand, and they don't really warrant their own separate lessons. Here are all the times purpose and audience have appeared in a past WACE exam between 2016 and 2022. 4 times in 2016, 3 times in 2017, twice in 2018, 3 times in 2019, twice in 2020, no times in 2021, and once in 2022. Hopefully, I have your attention. These concepts are very important. Relevant syllabus points, we have 3. First one, the role of the audience in making meaning, Unit 3. Second one, transforming and adapting texts for different purposes, contexts, and audiences. Note how purpose, context, and audience appears in the same syllabus point. Hint, hint. And our third syllabus point, analyzing content, purpose, and choice of language, comes from Unit 4. What are we going to do in this lesson? Firstly, we will understand purpose by defining purpose, explaining the interplay between purpose and genre. Then we will list general purposes of persuasive, imaginative, and interpretive texts. From there, we will shift to discuss audience. We will do that by defining audience, then we'll outline some categories of audiences. From there, we'll analyze past WACE exam questions. Specifically, we'll focus on examining a purpose question, then examining an audience question. Then we'll highlight some purpose and audience tips. From there, we'll summarize an outline that's nice and simple. Starting with purpose. What does this word mean? Our definition is, quite simply, the main function of a text. The word is not defined in the SCARSA glossary, but this is the best way to understand it. Nice and simple. So the purpose is the main function of a text. How does that relate to this idea of genre, which we learnt earlier on in this module? In a nutshell, the interplay between purpose and genre can be summarized as follows. The purpose of a text determines its genre. What's our authority for this statement? It is the syllabus. So even though the glossary doesn't define purpose, it tells us that the term types of text refers to classifications of texts according to the particular purposes they are designed to achieve. What can we take away from this? Firstly, this term classification of text hopefully sounds familiar because it refers to the genre of form and structure. Remember, genre of form and structure basically just refers to the types of text that we study in English ATAR. And those types of texts include movies, documentaries, novels, short stories, photographs, blog posts, articles, and so on. All of those are different classifications of texts. Secondly, in that glossary definition, we saw these words analytical texts, persuasive texts, imaginative texts, and interpretive texts. These types of texts are quite simply different genres of form and structure. They're different text types. Even though the glossary refers to these as types of texts, I'll just refer to them from here on in as text types. Rolls off the tongue a bit nicer, easier to say. Let's save some time. A quick reminder of how those text types manifest in English exams. The first text type that we saw on the previous slide was analytical texts, and analytical texts appear in the comprehending section and responding section of the exam, and we know that we refer to those as analytical questions. Then for the composing section, we know those questions are referred to as creative questions. Here I've said analytical questions and creative questions. How do those terms, analytical questions and creative questions, apply to those text types, analytical texts, persuasive texts, interpretive texts, and imaginative texts? That is what we're going to answer now. Starting with analytical questions. Now, in the comprehending section and the responding section, you are analyzing a text. In the comprehending section, you're analyzing unseen texts. And in the responding section, you're analyzing one seen text or two seen texts. The responses that you write in answering these analytical questions are actually analytical texts. They're analytical texts because they are texts that analyze other texts. Moving to creative questions, the text type of your response will either be, as we see here, persuasive, imaginative, or interpretive. Why is that? Because the creative questions that you get in the composing section require you to create a persuasive text, an imaginative text, or an interpretive text. In short, if you are answering an analytical question, you are creating an analytical text. If you are answering a creative question, you are creating a persuasive, imaginative, or interpretive text. If you're a bit unsure of the interplay between purpose and genre, the following examples illustrate the connection quite nicely. If the purpose of your text is to examine, the text type or the genre of form and structure will be analytical. If the purpose of your text is to argue something, the text type or the genre of form and structure will be persuasive. If the purpose of your text is to entertain, the text type or genre of form and structure will be imaginative. And if the purpose of your text is to inform, the text type or genre of form and structure will be interpretive. From these examples, hopefully we can see that purpose determines genre. Now let's move on to take a look at the general purposes of persuasive texts, interpretive texts, and imaginative texts. Why are we looking at these three text types and not looking at the purposes of analytical texts? Short answer is you rarely have to analyze an analytical text for its purpose. Here are some general purposes of persuasive texts. Here are some general purposes of imaginative texts. And here are some general purposes of interpretive texts. Pause the video now, skim through those purposes, come back once you're done. Trust me, these purposes will come in handy when we get to Module 5. Before we move on to audience, I'd like to briefly explain how those tables might be of use to you. And that is, you can use those general purposes to guide your articulation of a text's purpose or purposes. What am I talking about here? One of the general purposes in the purposes of imaginative text table is encourage the audience to think about ideas in different ways. If a question required you to articulate the purpose of a text, if you stated this purpose, the answer would be too general. This is not specific to the purpose of your text. Saying this is the purpose of the text is just a cookie cutter approach. It's telling the marker that you're not really analyzing the specific text. However, if you used this general purpose to form the baseline of a more specific purpose, then you'd be on the right track. In this example, a more specific purpose could be that Ex Machina encourages the audience to consider whether machines could become sentient. What we've done here is taken a general purpose from the table and use it as a foundation to then articulate a more specific purpose that is specific to the text. On to audience. This is how the glossary defines the word. The group of readers, listeners, or viewers that the writer, designer, filmmaker, or speaker is addressing. Audience includes students in the classroom, an individual, the wider community, review writers, critics, and the implied audience. Our focus is on this first sentence, but we're going to use a bit of a tweaked version of that for the English ATAR Made Simple definition, which is the group of readers, listeners, or viewers the text creator addresses. Before we move on, I want to quickly address what this term text creator in the definition really means. It refers to the creators of any text that you analyze in the comprehending section and the responding section, and you, because you create a text in the composing section. The point being here that in the composing section of the exam, you must determine who the audience is in your plan. you must determine who your text is targeted towards in your plan. And that is a good segue, a good segue to the next point. Text creators always have an intended audience in mind when they're creating a text. For example, an author of a kid's picture book will use simple diction because the author knows kids will be reading or listening to the book. Another example, a law student will use legal jargon in their essay because the law student knows that their law professor will be reading that essay, will be marking it. In other words, the text creator tailors the language they use based on their intended audience. Next up, categories of audiences, of which there are several. Audiences can be categorized based on education, prior knowledge, interests, gender, sex, profession, age, cultural background, economic status, generation, attitudes, geographic location, experiences. Based on this list, we can see that you can classify or describe an audience based on basically anything. For that reason, I'm not going to provide a list as extensive as the one you got for general purposes of persuasive, imaginative, and interpretive texts. But hopefully the following discussion gives you a good idea of how you can describe an audience or create a text for an audience. Before we get into that discussion, here is an acronym to remember the different categories of audiences. What is this? It is Epic Space Gauge. If you can come up with a better acronym, please let me know. Why bother remembering these different categories of audience in the first place? Quite simply, because these categories can help you articulate who the audience of a text is. For instance, if a question includes the term particular audience in it, I could scan through these categories of audiences in my head, pick one that is relevant to the text, and articulate a specific audience that falls within one or more of these categories. Let's take a look at the education category first. See what I did there? The question to ask: has the text creator targeted an audience with a particular level of education? Examples: the text creator might have targeted an audience with a primary school education, with a secondary school education, with a tertiary education, more specifically, with a bachelor's degree, with an honours degree, with a master's degree, with a PhD, an audience who have all done a particular internship, an audience who have all done a particular course, maybe like AIMS. Next category is prior knowledge. And the question to ask for this one is, does the audience already have an understanding of the subject matter? If they do, the text creator might not need to explain the fundamental concepts of the subject. If they don't have that prior understanding, then the text creator might need to explain the fundamentals. Example: you're giving a presentation to a bunch of kindergarten kids about safe ways to cross a road. And you tell them it's safe to cross when the person on the traffic light turns green. This presentation assumes the kids have a prior understanding of what the color green is, as opposed to red and yellow. Next category of audiences is interests. Question to ask: has the text creator targeted their text at an audience with a particular interest in something? Examples: vaping, arts and crafts, surfing, rowing. Next category, gender. Question to ask: has the text creator targeted their text at an audience that identifies with a particular gender? Examples: agender, bigender, cisgender, gender fluid, non-binary. I've included the definitions of each of those genders in the PDF study notes if you're curious. Sex. Question to ask: has the text creator targeted their text at an audience of a particular sex? Examples: male and female. Next up, profession. Question to ask: has the text creator targeted their text at an audience who belongs to a particular profession? Examples: doctors, graphic designers, content creators, influencers. Next category, age. Question to ask: has the text creator targeted their text at an audience who belongs to a particular age group or bracket? Examples: children, teenager/adolescent, young adult, middle-aged, elderly. In the PDF study notes, I've also included a bunch of other words that you can use to describe age brackets, such as the word denarian, which refers to a person between the ages of 10 and 19, a vicenarian, who is a person between the ages of 20 and 29, all the way up to, I think, 100. Using those sort of words to define an audience is a good way to impress the marker. Next category is cultural background. The question to ask: has the text creator targeted their text at an audience who belongs to a particular cultural background? Examples: African, African American, Australian, Chinese, Dutch, French, Italian, Irish, Japanese, Russian. You get the idea. Next category, economic status. Question to ask: has the text creator targeted their text at an audience who is of a particular economic status? Examples: high socioeconomic group, middle socioeconomic group, low socioeconomic group. Next category, generation. Question to ask: has the text creator targeted their text at an audience who belongs to a particular generation? There appears to be some debate over when these generations start and end, but this is the best that I could find on the internet. Gen Z, 1997 to 2012. Gen Y, aka Millennials, 1981 to 1996. Gen X, 1965 to 1980. Boomers, 1946 to 1964. Silent Generation, 1928 to 1945. Next category is attitudes. Question to ask: has the text creator targeted their text at an audience who holds a particular attitude towards something? Example: a group of Year 10 students hold a resistant attitude towards doing ATAR. Next category is geographic location. Question to ask: has the text creator targeted their text at an audience who resides in a particular area? Example: the city of Vincent distributes a flyer that introduces residents to the idea of the FOGO bin. Last but not least, experiences. Has the text creator targeted their text at an audience who has shared an experience? Examples: skydiving, an immersion program in the Philippines, big wave surfing. The list is endless. Moving on to a couple of past WACE exam questions. Let's take a look at a purpose question first. And our question is: explain how the perspective on the video game industry offered in Text 3 relates to the text's purpose. 2019 WACE exam, Section 1, Question 3. Text 3 is an extract of an open letter. The extract is in the PDF study notes. Follow along as I read it out. In your keynote to the Australian Content Conversation Conference, you spoke about audiences turning away from traditional linear content models and children growing up with Australian content. Why is it then that games don't seem to earn the credibility that film and TV receives? We know that 68% of Australians play video games. 98% of homes with children under the age of 18 have computer games. We don't want to take away from the screen industry. Rather, we've got a lot of value to bring, but we need to be at the table. The Australian video game development industry has huge potential as a weightless and clean export. It's an intensively creative industry, but also highly innovative and technical, and usually at the cutting edge of technology. In addition, games have the capacity to solve high-value problems. Australia has the potential to take an international lead in the emerging industry of serious games, games intended for non-entertainment purposes. These are games that are used to assist in dementia care, games that enable stroke patients to engage in rehabilitation exercises, games designed to promote road safety or deliver positive mental health outcomes for our youth. New technologies, such as virtual and augmented reality, will only increase the potential applications for serious games. Video games can also be harnessed for learning, particularly when it comes to getting Australian youth interested in STEM fields. Just look at the success of coding clubs, where children use and develop these skills in learning how to create their own games. Across other departments, the government has a proven model for assisting sectors like ours. For example, it has identified 6 industry sectors of competitive strength and strategic priority, and has invested in building Australian companies' expertise in these areas through the Department of Industry, Innovation and Science's Industry Growth Centres. Take cybersecurity. This is one area in which the government believes Australia can be a global industry leader. To that end, it set up the Australian Cybersecurity Growth Network, which has now been operational for 12 months and has been getting real traction. Just last month, the government launched the Cybersecurity Sector Competitiveness Plan, which provides a roadmap to strengthen Australia's cyber capabilities. Each of the 6 industry sectors has a champion in government. Cyber has 2, the Ministry for Industry, Innovation and Science, Arthur Sinodinos, and the Minister assisting the Prime Minister for Cybersecurity, Dan Tahan. We don't have a champion. In fact, we're not even on the radar. We know that Australians love high-quality, locally produced content and are consuming it in more ways than ever before. We know that Australia has a strong appetite for innovation and developing new sectors. To that end, supporting the Australian video games industry should be a no-brainer. We'd like to stay and play, but we've got serious business to do. That's the excerpt. How should we approach the question? Firstly, let's outline the main parts of it. The first part of it is perspective on the video game industry. Obviously, we haven't properly addressed this concept of perspective yet, so we'll reserve a proper discussion of it for the next lesson. The second main part of the question is the text purpose. This is obviously the part that we're going to focus on. An important thing to note is the word purpose appears in its singular form, purpose, rather than its plural form, purposes. In other words, our answer must clearly state one purpose rather than multiple. Here are some potential purposes of the text, bearing in mind that we would only just focus on one. One purpose could be to raise wider awareness of the potential of the video game industry. Another one could be to highlight how innovation in the video game industry can enhance various aspects of Australian society. Another purpose could be to convince Senator Fifield that the gaming industry requires greater government representation. And a final purpose could be to persuade Senator Fifield of the importance of having a seat at the table. Having a seat at the table would, in turn, enable the video game industry to participate in decision-making, which could ultimately allow Australia to become international leaders in the burgeoning field of games intended for non-entertainment purposes. Before we move to an audience question, I want to reiterate that we would just pick one of these purposes in answering this question because the question specifies the word purpose, meaning we must address that concept in its singular form. Audience question. It is, with reference to at least one text, discuss why a text created in one context may resonate with an audience in another context. 2022 WACE exam, section 2, question 4. And this is the sample text we are going to use. This is America, Childish Gambino, 2018. Check out the link in the resources tab below the video to look at the music video. One of my favorite music videos of all time, and a great song. A quick explanation of the video. It contains numerous metaphors about race and gun violence in America. For example, at the start of the music video, Gambino says, "This is America," while shooting a man in the head. Also, Gambino is dancing with school children in the foreground amid various violent acts taking place in the background. Approaching the question. In order to fully address this question, we'd have to do a few things. First, we need to clearly explain one context because that term is literally in the question. Then we would need to clearly explain another context because that term is in the question. From there, we'd need to articulate who an audience could be in another context, as we can see here. After that, we'd want to discuss why the text resonates with the audience in the other context. Those are the requirements of the question. How would we go about addressing them? I'll touch on the context stuff because we just looked at it in the previous lesson. And as I flagged at the beginning of this lesson, these concepts of audience, context, purpose, they interrelate. So what you're about to see is how we can weave a discussion of audience and context into one response where those two concepts appear in the question, where the question requires us to relate the concepts. Bearing that in mind, our main focus here is obviously on the audience part of the question. So our first requirement of the question is to clearly explain one context. I'm going to pick the context of production, which as we saw earlier is 2018. The music video was produced, released in 2018. Specifically, I'll focus on the context of culture. Notable aspects of the context of culture include the fact that there had been 4 mass shootings in the US in 2018 before the music video was released in May. Next main part of the question, the main requirement, is clearly explain another context. Let's say the context of reception is 2022. Once again, focusing on the context of culture. Just to be clear, I'm satisfying the another context requirement of the question because I'm discussing context of production, 2018, and then context of reception, 2022. And within those two different contexts, I'm referring to the context of culture within those two contexts. Returning to our context of reception, 2022. The text was released in May 2018. 2 years later, in May 2020, George Floyd, a 46-year-old African-American man, was murdered in the US city of Minneapolis by Derek Chauvin. This sparked a series of protests led by the movement Black Lives Matter. Next requirement of the question, articulate who an audience could be in another context. Some potential audiences include African Americans, people who oppose the right to bear arms, people who believe in racial equality. And this last one is the one that we're going to go with. The final main requirement of the question is to discuss why the text resonates with the audience in the other context. We could say something along the following lines to address this requirement. The text may resonate with people who believe in racial equality in the other context of 2022 because its messages about racism and gun violence in America are, disappointingly, as relevant today as they were in 2018. What we just did there was look at each part of the question and addressed each part of the question as we went. What I'd like you to do is to pause the video now and see how all of the separate parts interrelate. I want you to connect the dots between these various requirements of the question, because making those connections between the different parts of the question and the different concepts within it will enhance your understanding, which is ultimately what we're trying to do here. Finally, some purpose and audience tips. Firstly, be specific. Whenever a question includes the word purpose or audience, be as specific as possible when stating what the purpose is or who the audience is. For example, let's say you're answering this past WACE exam question. With reference to at least one text, discuss why a text created in one context may resonate with an audience in another context. This is the question we just looked at. One potential audience could be people who like music. That's very general. Another potential audience could be people who believe in racial equality. That is much more specific. The specific version wins. Next tip, texts have more than one purpose and audience. Although many questions require you to discuss just one purpose or audience, this doesn't mean the text itself has just one purpose or audience. In other words, you have a lot of flexibility in the way you express what the purpose is or express who the audience is. For example, let's say you're answering this past WACE exam question. Explain how the perspective on the video game industry offered in text 3 relates to the text's purpose. This was the question before last that we analyzed. Potential purposes could be raise wider awareness of the potential of the video game industry and to convince Senator Fifield that the gaming industry requires greater government representation. Those are 2 of the 4 purposes that we looked at, and this is evidence of the fact that one text has multiple purposes, multiple audiences. Final purpose and audience tip is beware the singular versus plural distinction. I've alluded to this one quite a few times already. If a question includes the word purpose or audience, you should refer to just one purpose or just one audience. For example, let's say you're answering this past WACE exam question. Explain how at least one text manipulates the conventions of genres for a particular purpose and context. 2017, section 2, question 4. That question clearly specifies the word purpose, singular, so you must just discuss one purpose. On the other hand, if a question includes the word purposes or audiences, you must discuss at least 2 purposes or at least 2 audiences. For example, let's say you're answering this past WACE exam question. Compare how 2 texts have been constructed for similar purposes but through different genres. In this example, you'd be required to articulate one purpose for one text, another purpose in another text, and then ultimately explain how they're similar. Those are our purpose and audience tips, and that is all the main content for this lesson. Let's do a simple summary of it. First main part of the lesson looked at the concept of purpose, and we saw our definition is simply the main function of a text. Then we looked at the interplay between purpose and genre, and the interplay is the purpose of a text determines its genre. For example, if the purpose of your text is to examine, then the text type or the genre, form, and structure will be analytical. Then we discussed the general purposes of persuasive, imaginative, and interpretive text, and we looked at those 3 tables, one for each of these 3 text types. A key takeaway here was that you should use the general purposes that are shown in those tables to guide your articulation of a text-specific purpose or purposes. Then we shifted to looking at audience, and our definition of audience is the group of readers, listeners, or viewers that the text creator addresses. There are an infinite number of possibilities, ways to articulate who an audience is, but these categories of audiences are a nice way of distilling all of that. As we saw, audiences can be categorized based on education, prior knowledge of the subject matter, interests, gender, sex, profession, age, cultural background, economic status, generation, attitudes, geographic location, experiences. In short, EPIG space gauge. Final main section of the lesson was looking at a few past WACE exam questions. We firstly looked at a purpose question, and then we looked at an audience question. The final part of this section of the lesson looked at some purpose and audience tips, of which there were 3. The first one, be as specific as possible when stating what the purpose is or who the audience is. The next one, texts have more than one purpose and audience, meaning you have flexibility in how you express either. Finally, beware the singular versus plural distinction. That is all the content for the lesson. What is the purpose of a text whose audience is also the context of production? I asked you that question at the beginning of the lesson. It was a trick question, but hopefully it got you thinking. Anyway, well done for getting to the end of this lesson. You're almost at the end of this module, and then we get into tackling each section of the exam. How exciting. The activities for this lesson are easier than the last few, so go and smash them out, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one on perspective. Until then, let's keep it simple.